Okay, here we go. Hello.
Hi. I am
Hi.
so excited to have this conversation.
Yes, me too. I've been excitedly reading all of your content and
Ah.
and thinking about I'm like this girl and I have a lot in common and the things that I want to talk about she's talking about. So
That's
and
exciting.
yeah, and what drew me to you most was your discussion on sexuality.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
you want to talk about sex?
Yeah, let's talk about sex. That's
Talk
my
about
favorite
sex.
topic. Particularly the intersection of sex and philosophy, which is
Yeah.
probably, we were talking about that. That's kind of what you first hooked onto about my writing.
Mhm.
So I write a newsletter, the Weird and Good newsletter, where it's mostly philosophy and psychology. So I will take these big, huge, heavy ideas and kind of distill them down into a few paragraphs and try to relate them to our modern life. And so one of the one of the philosophies that I personally keep coming back to is existentialism. So that's essentially the philosophy that says life does not inherently have meaning, but it is our task to give it that meaning.
Mhm.
And I think that if we look at sexuality through the lens of philosophy, but particularly existentialism, we can kind of understand where a lot of the problems with modern sexuality are stemming from. So, in a lot of ways, I think that in the West, particularly, we are the victims of our own freedom. We are kind of suffering our own success. So
Mhm.
we've done all this work to undo traditions and restrictions and cultural rules on sexuality. And that's good because that frees us to do what we want and to do what is better for us. So if you have, sexuality is very individualized to the person. People like different things, people like different people. And people maybe don't want to get married. And if in the past that would have been a problem, you would have kind of been scorned from society. Now it's totally fine. You can have 20 cats, go live your life, and people leave you alone. They don't like pelt your house with rocks or something. So that's good. That's a success. But at the same time, those rules and restrictions that we had did give meaning.
Mhm.
They did tell us what we were supposed to do and what we were not supposed to do. For some people, that worked. For some people, they followed that path, the very narrow path that was set before them, and it worked for them. For other people, it was horrifically burdensome, oppressive, and limiting. So now we're in a time in society where we've removed all those restrictions for the most part. And so everybody essentially can pursue the type of sexuality that, or the sexual life rather, in a very expansive way that suits them. But you have to pursue it. That's where I think we are lost right now. And that's why I like the lens of existentialism for understanding sexuality, because you have seen a lot of I want to say almost like pseudo philosophies pop up in the vacuum that we have created now, which is sex positive, or feminism has its own ideas of sexuality, that everything is viewed through certain cultural issues or power dynamics and things like that. And so these are frameworks for understanding sexuality, but again, they don't fit everyone. So I think that it's better to take a more individualized view of your sexuality and understand that you have been given the freedom to define it for yourself. And so I don't think a lot of people realize that. I think that we got rid of the rules and the regulations essentially. And in a sense, we tossed out the baby with the bathwater. So those rules and regulations were giving us structure and frameworks. Well, I won't do that. We tossed those things out. Now we're free. We don't exactly know what to do with that freedom. So we've been told it's okay to do whatever you want, whatever makes you happy. everything is fine. That's not how anybody lives their life. We don't go about our life saying, I do whatever makes me happy and anything I want. I wake up in the morning and I have kale for breakfast, not because it makes me happy, but because it's what I need to do to live a healthy life. So when we take this kind of, and it's almost like a little bit of an interestingly immature perspective to sexuality, which is do whatever you want, have fun, it's all good. It's like, I think sex is much more serious than that. I don't think it's a hobby. I don't think it's a game. It's something that's very personal. It's something that's very powerful. And that is a little bit something that we're negating by removing all of the frameworks that we have for navigating sexuality, and instead kind of just telling, hey, people, do whatever you want. You do whatever you want, but make sure you have chosen what you're going to do, or else your society and other people are going to dictate that for you. And that's a problem. That's quite burdensome. Yeah.
And we've also, I think we've also created new boxes without realizing it. We're like, we're escaping this quote patriarchal box and we're going to make our own box.
Exactly.
I think it's really just about the counter identity now. It's like, well, I'm going to counter identify that thing that I'm told is oppressive. It's like, well, you just oppressed yourself by making yourself fit into another category. And it's mind-blowing to think that, I just had another conversation a couple weeks ago with this woman who was like, I know that like the content can be super triggering to think, okay, well, there were rules and structures in place for society in order for things to work out for the best. And people think, well, no, it couldn't have been the best because now we have the best. It's like, really? How's your sexuality? Do you feel healthy? Do you feel like the sleeping around that you're doing is healthy for your system, especially as women?
Yeah. And this is a conversation that no one wants to have.
No.
It is, and this is a big, big, big thing, I think, because so when we talk about freedom, we love to talk about that. Oh, I'm free to do whatever I want. I can choose to do whatever makes me happy. Wonderful. Now you have the responsibility to make those choices consciously. And that's what I think is a very important part of understanding that it's a lot of work to remove all those frameworks. It's not just toss them out and we're free. Now you have to make them. It's not just, I've tossed out the path or the rules of the previous society and now I can exist unburdened. You're essentially in a vacuum of meaninglessness until you set that meaning upon your own life. And so I kind of think that, and this is something I see in particularly my generation is, we're not, the animosity, particularly between the sexes, is quite high now. Yeah. And that's an interesting thing because if our sexuality has become so free and if we are, never been happier, you would think that there would be a more of a peace treaty essentially between the sexes. And yet instead, the animosity seems to be increasing in that regard. And that's not entirely new. That's something that's been happening for decades. But I think, you look at a lot of the younger generation and it's almost like they went to the other side of the grass is greener on the other side. Okay, when I get rid of all these stupid rules and I say, oh, I'm gonna have sex with the first person I see them, whatever, it doesn't matter because it doesn't mean anything. Sex is whatever I want it to be, and that means I want it to be whatever it is. There's no cohesive structure for understanding. It's just essentially like, it's just something we do. Okay, sure. How is that working out for you? Because in my generation, I see unprecedented levels of depression, and women particularly seem extremely angry. It's, we have more freedom to be sexually expressive than ever before, and yet we are more angry towards men, and in some ways our own femininity. I think there has been a strange disavowal of femininity in the modern woman. And I don't mean that in, it's so easy to get pegged when you have these conversations of, oh, you're a conservative, or, oh,
yeah.
And it's like, great, okay, write me off, fine, don't listen to me because I'm, not following perfectly the talking points. But I think, it's an interesting thing because historically, women have not preferred very casual sex and with early partners. And that makes a lot of sense because birth control is a very recent invention. So for a long time, sex had a really big repercussion, very big. And if you go even far enough back, actually, it's not even that far back. If you go just a few centuries back, it wasn't even just, oh, well, I'm going to have a kid. Oh, that sucks. You could die. Childbirth was very dangerous.
Yeah. And not only that, but, we've always had, I think as young women, we've always had an issue with choosing the right partner. That's always going to be an issue with a young woman, but you add birth control on top of that, which biologically cuts you off from choosing the right partner. And then add on this social construction of, freedom and all of this, liberated woman. I almost just said nonsense just there, but
be careful.
Be careful. But it's true. Like we don't have the capability of having it all. We're going to cut some part of ourselves off in order to try to make that happen. And in trying to make that happen, we just dig ourselves a bigger hole.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a strange thing. It's almost lately, and I'm getting into a conversation that I shouldn't even really be talking about this because I want to think it through very carefully. But I think there's a strange in human beings. We have always been a little bit angry at nature. And I'll explain that. Nature is the limits upon our life. Nature is what kills us. Nature is what threatens us, whether it's a natural disaster, it's a predator, it's our own body failing to work. All the things that we make in society are essentially to control nature. We have a house, we keep nature outside of it. We have medicine, we stop nature from taking its course with our body when we can. Birth control is absolutely the middle finger to nature. And I'm not entirely, it's not.
I'm going to put that as the podcast episode title.
Yes, I like that. And it really is,
it's true.
Because you're basically saying we're not abiding by this ancient form of biology that has always existed and still exists for the entire rest of the animal kingdom, pretty much. And we're just, within a few centuries, which is the blink of an eye in terms of human existence. That's essentially, you closed your eyes and you were living in a cave, and you opened your eyes and you were living in a penthouse looking over New York City with a smartphone and a robot butler in 2020. Like you would probably go insane. Yeah. So we're having this massive change, and it's tricky because we only know our own life. It's very hard to think about, oh, well, if I was a person that had never understood or had the opportunity to have a thing like birth control, how would I feel in this modern society? We don't really think like that. We kind of just, for a lot of young women now, birth control has always been an option. So and I think this is an interesting thing because, are you hearing my headphones doing that? No, right? Okay, no. Good, because they're making little noises, and I'm like, stop interrupting me. So birth control is an interesting thing because not only does it cut us off from nature, and that's not, again, I'm not against birth control. I'm totally against, planning when you have children and all of that, and using certain options to control your reproduction. That's totally fine. But, we need to take it very much more seriously than we are taking it. There are repercussions to every major change we make, and that can be a cost and benefit analysis. But with birth control, not only are we able to kind of completely change sex. It completely changes sex, because something that was once had an immediate repercussion that naturally inclined us as women toward being much more conservative in our sexuality and much more selective in our partners. Now we've opened sex up to be almost a kind of recreation, which That's unprecedented. That never could have happened previously. I mean, you would have had to be very careful, and essentially sex was only recreation once you were already pregnant, or you were
Right.
somehow you managed to not have kids.
And this is the idea behind no sex before marriage, because if you
Mm-hmm.
weren't married, then you didn't have the opportunity to, you'd be getting pregnant unwed, and then you'd have no
It was
support.
horrible shame. Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
not, and a lot of people think now that it has to do with oppression of religion, like religious oppression on women. And if you really look closely at it, it's more of like a protective measure pre-birth control days.
Absolutely. And I think, it's a thing again, like the baby in the bathwater thing. Okay, sure. There are some elements, the forced aspect of the cultural beliefs in no premarital sex might be the oppressive part, because maybe for whatever reason in your life you have decided, oh, this is appropriate for me, blah blah blah, fine. And if you were going to be stoned or jailed, if you went against that, that would be definitely oppressive. But it's not that that's the only quality to it. And that's where we make a mistake, is where we say, this was only designed to oppress women. Probably not. There's probably a reason that major religions and societies worldwide have all come to a similar conclusion about, let's be more careful with our sexual behavior. Again, this is another thing, is that for the majority of history up until very recently, and it still exists today, but it's much more controlled, sex could have killed you. You could get a disease. It's
Yeah.
that simple.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of reason behind why historically we were much more selective, and we had many more rules around our sexuality. Now we have this freedom where we don't have to worry about disease in the same way. We don't have to worry about pregnancy in the same way. So the very obvious markers of, oh, well, these were the restrictions, they're gone. So we're losing that there was a few other more subtle things there that naturally came about, which is, I think, so sex is ultimately, the purpose of sex is creation. It's not solely for pleasure. And it's an interesting thing that we are the way we are now in society, where it is almost solely for pleasure for many people. It's completely divorced from its origins as a source of creation and life. And this is so easy to get into some place where I'm like, sex is special and precious, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, it is in some ways, but not, in this type of way. I really mean that in the sense of, this is an ancient piece of wisdom that humans have always known and worshipped. That sex was almost magical, in that it is the one way in all of our lives and world that you can create life. And especially if you go back several centuries, and that's just pure magic to people, because they've yet to discover the science behind how that happens. So this is an act that creates a person. That's pure magic. Now, that's the origin of sex. That's almost the defining quality of what sex is for almost the entire human history. And overnight, we've been able to completely divorce that quality from sex and render it almost something entirely for pleasure.
Right. It seems to a little bit like it goes hand in hand with how we've divorced our bodies from nature in general, like in all other kinds of ways.
That's very interesting. Yes, I think and we've divorced pretty much everything we can from nature. And there's reasons we do that, because nature is brutal. I mean, it doesn't take long. I always think it's funny when I walk around. And I'm in LA. It's not like I'm like living in the mountains somewhere. That would be nice, but you don't have to go far to see nature. You can just walk down your sidewalk and you'll see some poor bee being torn apart by a million ants alive. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's nature. Nature
Yeah.
is not going to wait. Oh, he's not dead yet, don't eat him alive. Or, oh, give him a sedative, that's very painful. Or, oh, it's maybe not so appropriate to do that because this is it's ugly. No, nature has none of these concerns for our sentimentalities and our ethics. None of it. It's
Yeah.
survival. And
We've grown kind of scared of all of that too, because we're so pampered and by
mhm.
technology. I recently had a conversation with my boyfriend about, he's reading Seneca, and
Oh.
we were talking about, I think it was Seneca, and he was talking about how it's fascinating how scared we are of death now.
Mhm. Mhm.
Whereas they used to not be so scared of death. And in fact, you'd have a baby, and if the baby was deformed or would grow up to have an issue, you would just leave it to die.
Yeah.
And that's like, and it's almost like, is that human nature?
Hmm.
Like, is that like a big piece of human nature? Not to say that we should be doing that now, of course,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we're evolving. The
Mhm.
idea is to evolve away from things like that, which is wonderful. But the fact is that it, in the timeline of history that you speak of, that wasn't that long ago. And
Mhm.
same goes for sex and sexuality. Are
Mhm.
we really, are we really becoming more pampered so much that we just cannot handle anything that life would actually naturally throw at us?
I think that that's fascinating, and I think that that quality of how divorced we are from our nature today is, and this is not to say, I think I always have to make these clauses that to argue the benefits of one thing does not mean that the other side is inherently wrong and evil, and that the side I'm arguing the benefits of is inherently good. It's that we need to know what we're leaving behind and what it was serving for us so that we can understand what kind of vacuum we're creating and what we might want to replace it with. And so that comes back to the discussion of okay, so you have no religion now, or no culture that dictates what you do with your sexuality. What will you do with it? And I think society essentially is constantly a fleeing from nature. We don't want to deal with any of the things that nature foists on us. And it's funny because with the pandemic, you really see it's like that's the fight that we still have. We have not been able to control that part of nature yet. It's interesting because it's not lions, it's not wolves, it's not it's not even so much natural disaster. It's tiny microbes and viruses that we
Mm.
can't see, and that's
Mm-hmm.
nature, and they can wipe us out. And that's amazing that nature still holds on to that power to remind us, no, you are not immortal, and I still am knocking at your door. And so of course we run from that and we try to keep it out of our lives as much as possible. But I think that there's a risk, especially in us as modern people that are so sheltered. We really truly live on the inside of the palace walls, and outside is the wolves and the disease. And it's interesting because it reminds me a little bit of the story of Buddha and how he came to basically be enlightened. Was he lived always within the palace walls, and his father wanted him to inherit the throne essentially, and so he protected him from all the brutality of nature. Essentially, he hid him from sickness, from death, from poverty, from all these things. And so finally, when he was outside of the palace walls, he saw a sick man, dying, a corpse, and things like this. And he was like, "What is that?" And I think I forget who it was, what's the name of the character that was with him, but was like, "That's sickness. That happens to all of us." And so it's interesting because we're a little bit in that like baby Buddha, like pre enlightenment form, where we've lived within the palace walls for so long that we don't even know anymore what lurks on the other side. And I think that makes us a little insane in a way, because it divorces us from reality a bit. So again, to go back to the discussion of how that ties into sexuality. So it's good to know what's on the other side of the palace walls. So you're not at risk of getting some horrible disease and losing your mind of syphilis, if you do the right things. You're not at risk of having 12 children and dying in childbirth if you do the right things. But this is what our legacy was. This is the legacy of sex. And so it's a little bit, to me, not grounded in reality to treat sex so flippantly when it stems from so much that is deeply serious and life threatening in many cases. So it's good to, you know, view sex with that kind of seriousness. And I think that this is something that can be actually really liberating in a true sense, not simply throw off all the rules and do whatever you want. Well, okay, what do you want? And this is the
Right.
mistake I think that people make, is
I
just that's it.
Yeah, I think I like what you said earlier about having to figure out how to do this, how to parse this out for yourself. And that really struck a chord because it makes me think about how none of us, because we've so quickly become a society, a very specific type of society, none of us have had the keys handed to us to navigate that. And so we're creating from a place of confusion and having to find where you are with your own sexuality and what is best and what is healthy when no one has been able to tell you what is actually healthy. And in fact, all of the messages you get are to do the things that are probably pretty unhealthy. Is
Yes.
very confusing. And so it is difficult, especially as a young woman, to make the right decisions. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think that is really hitting the nail on the head. And I think that it's an interesting thing, because I really think when you look at your society and you see displays of gratuitous sexuality and everything, sexuality to sell a car, sexuality in music, sexuality and to sell jeans everywhere, you don't see intimacy. We only show you raw sexuality, or we show you unhealthy displays of quote unquote intimacy, which is I'll die without you. That's not intimacy, that's addiction. And so, we're not being given the map essentially for planning out our own sexuality in this brave new world, this wild west of sex, where all the restrictions we once had that were naturally imposed on us, those were, I mean, sure, you can blame religion all you want, but you still got sick and disease or pregnant from sex. That was still always the thing that happened. We just eventually decided, hey, how about we just tell people that this God will be really mad if they do that, and that'll help them, figure it out on their own, instead of everybody making the
Yeah.
same mistake all the time.
Maybe God is society.
Yeah, exactly. In some ways,
Yeah.
this is true. It dictates, our behavior and our beliefs. And isn't
I
that
wonder,
getting?
I wonder when, because it'll happen, when that pendulum swing will go right back to more of a
Mhm.
conservative stance and we'll start to put up the walls again. But maybe we'll be doing that in a much healthier way, not like a restricting
Mhm.
women's capabilities kind of way, but more in like a promotion. I mean, I'm just being hopeful here, but like a promotion of what intimacy is over overt sexuality. And I wonder if we will start to, I mean, this is the more negative wondering if we'll start to go right back to conservatism or religion, and have that be the progressive message.
That's an interesting thought, because it is definitely a risk. That's something that even happens in your own interpersonal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Is we tend to bounce back and forth. So if your last partner was really clingy, oftentimes the person will go into the opposite direction and pursue someone that's extremely distant. And there's a hope that as the pendulum swings, it slows and starts to land in the middle. But if we don't, I think, and that's the thing, that's, why you go to therapy for your relationships, is so that you learn the lesson instead of being stuck in the pattern. And if we don't learn the lesson behind why we make those restrictions, and we just resent them, and then we suffer without them, and then we run back to them, and then we resent them again. It's like every few generations we break something, and then we realize, oh, that's what that thing was doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, build it back. And then we forget why we built it a few generations later, and then we break it again. We're like, why is this thing in my way? Break it. Oh my gosh, it was doing something. So I think it's useful to understand, why did we have those restrictions? It's not that you need to impose the same exact restrictions on yourself in the same exact way, but rather, what restrictions do you want? And I think that's what's missing from the idea of, the sexual liberation movement, and women's liberation, every liberation. Liberation is not turning someone out into the wilderness and saying, well, you're free now. That's not the freedom you want. I mean, we live in a society, and we're not free in every sense. I can't go out and walk in the street naked. I can't go to my neighbor's house and say, I want this, I take it, because there are no rules on the land. We give up some freedoms in our society so that we can enjoy others. So I don't just take whatever I want, because I wouldn't want someone to do that to me. And so I give up that freedom to do, quote unquote, whatever I want. And it's better that way, because I'm able to live in a functioning society, and I have the benefits of protection and blah, 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 and all these things. So similarly, with sexuality, you don't really want this kind of total freedom, because in a way that it's very chaotic. And I think you can liken it to the kind of freedom you would experience if someone dropped you into the wilderness alone. Sure, there's no rules, there's no law, but
yeah, it's
little
the
bit
other
stressful.
it's the other side of the castle walls, and which, while it seems free, it can also present a harsh reality, which is, I do need, I am a fallible human, and I do need these things in place so that I can function healthily in intimacy.
Exactly. And I think that's, and there's a beauty in that. There's a beauty now that what we have achieved. And I think this is the thing that we miss so much when we get so caught up on the do whatever you want, have fun, be free. Okay, whatever, great. That's not how I live my life. I don't, wake up and say, do whatever I want, be fun, be free. No, I wake up and I'm like, here's your to-do list. You have to go to the gym. You have to eat these stupid vegetables that you don't like. Here's a bunch of stuff you have to do that you don't like. And then at the end of the day, oh, okay, I'm done. I did all these things that I don't like, and now I get to enjoy the fruits of that. So, make some restrictions on your own life and decide, well, what are the things? Of course, if I meet someone and I'm super attracted to them, oh, I would love to have sex with them right away. I don't do it. I place that restriction on myself because I know what it is for me also. And that may be different for another person, but I know that that doesn't serve me very well because, well, what do I want? Do I truly just want casual sex with people that I don't really know yet? Okay, maybe some people do. I don't. I am very, I like relationships. I like emotional connection. I like true intimacy. So if I'm getting sex, but I'm not getting those other things, I'm not really getting what I want. So to me, I place that restriction on myself, and it takes some discipline. And I think this is an interesting thing because, it's again the other side of freedom, which is that responsibility. So yeah, you have this freedom now, but that's not always so fun because now you're the one that has to essentially oppress yourself. So
I wonder if we can put a more positive spin on it in terms of like, I hate these vegetables I eat every morning. Because instead of that, sometimes I find that it's easier to say, like, I am enjoying the thing that this gives me, which is the freedom to feel good.
Yes,
or the freedom to do the things I want to do by setting myself up for health or whatever. Because when you say that, it really reminds me of a lot of these Greek philosophers, which I'm sure I have a feeling that you come from a lot of that.
Yeah.
Because
Probably
it's,
bringing out, yeah.
yeah, because it really, what it is, I mean, but there's something beautiful in that interpretation too, because it's really just about embracing responsibility in terms of what I need to do for society, what I need to do for myself. And that rigid structuring is pleasurable in some way to a lot of people.
I absolutely agree. And, I think that when I place restrictions on myself, in the moment, I definitely don't want to eat, my stupid kale. I would love to have like a donut for breakfast or something, whatever. But then after the third morning I do that, I feel bad. I feel bad about myself. I feel sick. I break out, so it's like in the moment, maybe the kale doesn't taste so good all the time, but you know what you're doing this essentially for in the long run. And it's an interesting thing because we struggle so much with this now with sex, in the sense of just the idea, just that word, take responsibility for your sexuality. Oh, it sounds so icky to people. I know, like, this is like, oh, what do you mean take responsibility for, even the word responsibility kind of has this air of
It's oppressive.
yeah, it's like, oh, I'm like someone's parent or something, or like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, really, it is the greatest honor to take responsibility for your sexuality, because you're the adult now. And this is the interesting thing that I think is the dark side of the rhetoric that's all, happy, happy, joy, joy about do whatever you want, have sex, be fun, is that that's for children. This world where, do whatever you want, you don't need to feel bad about things. I mean, don't feel shameful about things, but you should notice what makes you feel better and what does make you feel worse. And I know, after, decades of being around and seeing my friends, kind of going with the status quo of sexuality, and me being an absolute prude, my friends, like, they make fun of me all the time. They're like, you're repressed, girl. And I'm like, well, that's fine. I'm not the one that's like, oh, this guy is an asshole or whatever. I have to deal with it. But and I've seen the toll it takes on people when they kind of let society dictate the rules for them, which is no rules, do whatever you want. And it doesn't make them feel better, doesn't make them happy. And it really
Yeah.
much reminds me of like this thing of like, okay, you have a child and you say do whatever you want. That child's going to be miserable. They're going to eat a bunch of candy, they're going to get a stomach ache, and then they're going to like stick their finger in an outlet and electrocute themselves. Like, you can't do that. You have to be the adult and put restrictions on yourself. That's what being an adult is. That's what taking responsibility for yourself is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have, coming from a lens of the body, which is what
Mm.
I work with, right? And I'm always telling people how to be in touch with their body in order to make decisions like this.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen more often than not, I've seen young women say, oh, well, I can't get wet, or I can't, I can't orgasm, I can't do all these things. And it's like, well, do you like the person you're sleeping with?
Yeah.
And you should see their faces just go, oh,
Oh my
what does it mean
gosh.
to not like someone? What does it mean to not want someone inside of you? What does it mean to not want to have sex with someone in particular? And it's like, well, are you attached enough to your needs to
Mm-hmm.
make that decision? And sometimes I think the best way to attach yourself to, or to reintegrate with that part of yourself that's being an adult and taking care of and taking responsibility, is
Mm-hmm.
to notice how your body feels in those situations. And once
Mm-hmm.
people tap in, which is hilarious, right? Because we're talking about tapping into nature.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Once we tap into that, we get our answer, and it's like, oh, I've been making decisions based on what this messed up societal kind
Mm-hmm.
of messaging is.
Absolutely. Wow, that's fascinating. I think that that's so interesting. I know people that have the same struggle, and they kind of are in that same issue where it's, you have to, you really have to, it's a funny thing because it almost sounds a little bit new agey or whatever, like, oh, make take figure out your life path or whatever. It really isn't even that magical. Just sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil and say, what do I want from sex? What is too much for me? What do I not like? What is a no in a partner for me? You know, what are my my goals from sex? Like, do I just want physical pleasure and that's it? If maybe, but if not, then why is that all that you're basing your decisions for sex on, you know?
Validation is a big one. Am I just looking for validation? Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah.
Or, you know, like a very sickly substitute for intimacy is something that I've seen. And this is something I think, again, is where we get into, you know, sex is very philosophical in some ways. It's really, it always has been more than just sex, and that's why I really reject this this kind of like everything goes, sex is whatever, sex is sex. Like, it is not just sex. It never has been. You know, one of the things that I wrote about in the newsletter that I think was the one that we initially started talking because of was the history of sex not being just sex, which I love. So if you go back, like to ancient Babylon, there is in many different societies, but particularly in ancient Babylon is one of the more well-documented ones. There is the ritual of sacred prostitution, which is interesting because we think a lot of the ancient world as these like dusty old conservative people, and in some ways their sex was way better than a lot of the sex that we're having today, because they had all these frameworks for it and they understood how powerful it was. We're kind of stuck in this, you know, oh, sex is just sex, we don't need all these rules about it. I don't know about that, because like I said, you know, only because of our being divorced from nature can we say sex is just sex. Sex has always been either a threat to life or the creation of life. Only now is sex just sex. And you know, so sacred prostitution was interesting because you had these I think they were called high sex priestesses, and they would engage in ritual sex in the temple as a form of tribute to goddesses of sexuality. So Aphrodite, Venus, Ishtar, these are goddesses of sexuality. And so it's so interesting how we've lost so much of the literature and the culture that surrounds sexuality, that has surrounded it for just thousands of years. And today we're in this kind of like almost a mechanical type of sexuality, that it's just the act. And we come from a legacy of sex being much more than just, you know, the act itself. It was seen as something truly powerful. And that's where you get the Eastern philosophy of Tantra, the idea of using sex to achieve a better self, to achieve a form of enlightenment, which I'm not as familiar with the Eastern Tantra, so I'm not going to talk about that because I'll probably, you know, not do it justice. But there is an equivalent in the West, which was definitely not as weighty and meaty as the Eastern Tantra, but it is born of that same idea that sex is powerful enough that it can be used for more than just carnal pleasure. And it's called sex magic. And so sex magic, and it's a very interesting thing because once again, you know, I think people, if you're kind of like, oh, I'm into new age stuff and whatever, you go into a new age shop and you find like one of those little books that's like tantric sex, or, you know, sex prayers and stuff like that. And it's okay, let me go call up my friends with benefits guy, and then we're gonna do sex magic. No. That's not how it works. You know, you have, again, here is sex with a ton of rules. And those rules were applied particularly to harness the power of sex. And so, again, we really scoff at the old religious rules, because I think in some way it's like, kind of our grandma's thing. We're like, oh, grandma, sex before marriage is fine. We just kind of resent it, almost like irrational children. It's like there is more there, but fine, throw it out, forget about it. Let's look at instead sex magic, which was kind of in its heyday in the 1800s in Victorian society, which we kind of really think as this very conservative society. And they weren't entirely, it's a little bit of a stereotype, but they were not cool with sex magic being brought out to the masses. And Aleister Crowley, which this is the school of occultism, he was one of the proponents of sex magic. And of course, Victorian society was clutching their pearls over this, but it follows the same kind of framework that religion does, which is we're going to view sex as absolutely more than just sex, not inherently bad. On the contrary, inherently good, powerful, but if used properly. And so sex magic, it started with, like, the first writings on it was Pascal Randolph in the mid 1800s. And one of the first rules was don't even look at doing sex magic until you have a wife or a husband. And of course, we'll say, oh, when you got to be married. Fine, forget about that. But you need to have a partner. The point was a partner whom you trust deeply, who you are deeply connected to, and you are in sync with.
Otherwise, it might not work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's really interesting to notice too that within these rigid systems, there's an expansiveness and something so intensely beautiful to look at. So much more that there's rigidity around it, because when there are no boundaries, we go bouncing from one thing to another, and we can't ever get deep into anything.
Yes, I like that. That is a very good point. And if you think about it, so that idea of boundaries, it's interesting. And I think that's that's kind of like the progression of human development. Eventually we learn to, accept certain boundaries in our life. When you're a child, you kind of just, I want whatever I want. I scream if I don't get what I want, and then you start to grow up and accept certain rules. No, you have to go clean your room. Oh, I'm going to throw a tantrum. But then eventually you just do it. And so we're taught, hopefully by your caregivers, to accept certain boundaries in life. And you'll find these boundaries all over life, and we don't recognize them so easily. But art is the art of boundaries. You don't have art without drawing a boundary around something, whether it's, you throw it could be a Pollock, I don't care. You have to put something there. There has to be a line. There's still a canvas around, the painting ends at
Defines.
the edges of the canvas.
There's a
Exactly.
definition around it, to keep it in a space that makes it art.
Exactly.
And otherwise it would be life. Otherwise it would just be a scattered life thing.
Exactly. It's so interesting because in so many ways, when we put the frame around something is when we can really understand it and go deep with it. And the same thing is with sexuality. I think you can have it all and have a more, maybe a more surface experience, or you can really go extremely narrow and deep, and maybe that would be characterized as you have a single partner who you've been with for a very long time, and you explore depths of your sexuality that you could never do with someone that you just met. You can't do that. You have to be able to, and that's, goes back to the idea of sex magic, which was, this is an idea that already existed, was sex is powerful, but how can we unlock that power? Well, there's certain restrictions we need to apply. And that's, same thing. You want to have, a fit body, you got to have restrictions. You want to be a great writer, you got to sit down and write and not go do something fun. You have to go do the hard work at some time. We place restrictions in our lives all the times so that we can get to better things. And that's the thing. Again, that's the beauty of saying, well, I'm going to pick the restrictions that I place because I have a certain goal that I want. I don't place I don't place many restrictions on myself about eating too much. I might be complaining about kale, but that's probably the only vegetable. The rest of the day I eat mostly what I want. And that's fine with me because I don't have a goal of being, like a super fit person. I'm okay with, a mild level of fitness and health. That's my goal. So you define the restrictions you want to place upon your life based on what your goal is.
Mm-hmm.
That is the danger, is that we're not telling people, we threw out the restrictions and we said, do what you want. It's like that meant you make the restrictions, not just live without
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. And I wonder if creating these restrictions too defines ourselves to us more than ever before, because if you operate with some sort of rigidity, then, you know, it's funny. And by rigidity, I mean, not this is me and I will only stay in this box, but rigidity in I have a goal. I'm going to work towards that goal. I think it was Jordan Peterson who really was talking about like creating, like if you don't wake up in the morning and you don't have a goal, if you wake up in the morning and you don't have a goal, then you're creating, poor habits for yourself. And it's goals. It's so linear, and I think that's why a lot of these things, this thinking appeals to men. And
Good
so
point.
and I see a lot, and I talk a lot because I talk from the point of Taoism. I talk about the feminine from the point of Taoism, and how we are the yin and we are cyclical. It's actually more of a challenge, I think, maybe for women to stay in that cyclical being and then also create linear traits based on like these boundaries for themselves. So it's really interesting to watch a society bust out with this whole like new feminine, I am a cyclical being, I am watery, I am airy, and then having to put those restrictions on ourselves. I mean, there's so many components to that, and I wonder, like how we strike an even balance between those two things.
That is such an amazing point. I think where that gets very interesting and tricky is, so we want we want what has for a long time been the domain of the male, which is we want to work, we want to pursue goals, we want to have we want to have it all, and that's fine, you can do that. But you are going to face that challenge of going into a kind of mindset that is been long different from what women have been occupied with. So, I'm reading this interesting book. I think it's called The Demonic Creativity and Rage, something like that. I can't remember exactly. And
Sounds hefty.
oh, it's like every sentence I'm like, gotta sit down with that for a while. But the author talks about how if you look at from the Jungian perspective, you have the anima and the animus, and so like that's corresponds essentially to the yin and yang. So the masculine and the feminine, and the feminine has been for a long time characterized as being, just pure being. And that's a really interesting thing. So that would be that circular framework that you mentioned, where the masculine is characterized as linear, as doing. And this is really interesting because this is where you get that very tricky sexual psychology where men often feel the need to prove their masculinity, that's not so much of a concept for women.
Right.
Women don't you really need to prove their femininity that much, particularly throughout history, because femininity is being. It is already there. It is cyclical. Whereas the masculine is linear and is doing. So that's a super interesting thing because that's where you get that thing of like men constantly have to show their manliness, show that masculinity. And so we're kind of starting to mix these in society, which is an interesting experiment. Let's see what we do. I personally quite like it. I like being allowed as a woman to pursue different forms of life that were not allowed for women previously. So cool. But it's a huge change, So we're, as women now, almost having this kind of masculine element added to our sexuality where, like never before, we are now able to do sex just like men, essentially.
I've talked about this so much. I talk about this all the
Really?
time. Yes, because when I first started, so I'm not your typical sex educator, obviously. And when I first started, I put up some posters. I wrote some blog posts, and I was like, why are women trying to have sex like men? Why are women throwing around dildos and being like, I can fuck however I want, I can be whatever I want? And I'm like, I understand the concepts, but also we're rejecting a part of ourselves that is so necessary in being women. And I got a lot of shit for that.
I bet.
And I will continue to get shit for that because I stand by it. And I think that if we're going to embrace ourselves as women, we need to embrace our natural state. And that can come with so many different ways of being masculine and ways of being feminine. Like, we don't have to adhere. We can experiment with
pick
that.
and choose. Yeah.
Right. But we also need to acknowledge that we have a biology, and that biology is innate, and we're not going to escape that. It's nature. We can't escape it.
There you go. You can fight it all you want, but it's still there.
Right.
And I think that's, I think I mentioned earlier on how there's a strange development that I feel like I'm noticing where I really feel like modern women, and this is so hard to say without getting it without it sounding, like I'm some kind of like Puritan or something.
I know.
And it's funny because I'm really like, I'm the opposite of that. But here is the truth, is that in a lot of ways, modern women are rejecting the traditional vision of femininity. We don't want to be tied to, you say this idea of like, hey, maybe casual sex isn't something that women too much enjoy. And it's just this outrageous, how could you possibly assert that women do not like to have sex in the same way that men have always liked to have sex? That is just totally sexist and irrational. It's like, I don't know. And then, you just back that up with, well, look at history. And, like we've already said, there's a lot of reasons why women would have been naturally inclined to avoid lots of casual sex. But now, if you say that, you're kind of, it's like a dirty thing to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's, it's, and why? That's the thing that I think is so interesting here. So we want to be feminist. We want to be, we want to champion equality and say women are powerful and great, but don't you dare suggest that women's sexuality isn't exactly like men's. What?
I know. It's ridiculous. But this is why we need to have these conversations, because there are young women out there who need to hear this, and they need to know that if they, if something is going on for them, that they need to be able to talk about these things. They need to be able to know that that there are women out there who have liberal minds, who still have ideas about, how our bodies need to behave or to be treated. That there's people out there who will say, yes, please experiment with who you are, and also be safe and hold yourself in accountability and responsibility and love yourself.
Yeah.
And maybe that requires some restriction.
Absolutely. Everything does. Life does. Life is so great when you get to choose the restrictions that you place on yourself, because that's how you define yourself. And I think that's a little bit of a more beautiful way to look at it. When you have the sculptor and you have the block of marble, how do you take it from an amorphous block that means nothing and has no value besides the pure material into a priceless work of art? You define it, you chip away at it, and you limit it, you remove certain things, and you create a border around it, boundaries. So this is how you make yourself, by deciding, what do I like and what do I not like? What do I want and what do I not want? And then you align your behavior with those goals.
And if it's in your highest good.
Exactly. You know,
long
that's
term.
yeah, absolutely. I
Definition
mean,
comes with, in order to define, you need to refine.
yeah, yeah. And I think I really like the point that you put about young girls, because that's something that I think is such a disservice that we're doing right now. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I know that a lot of the intention is good behind the idea of like, do whatever you want, have fun, have sex, blah blah. Okay, this is it's in a way a half-baked reaction
Yeah.
to the previous sense of oppression, which is before they told us to do nothing, we were not allowed to do anything. So now do everything.
Right.
So it's like,
Hopefully,
let's scale
hopefully
that
we
back.
can start to scale that back for sure. And I mean, that's what makes you and I different, people with different opinions. Whether or not someone views that as the wrong opinion is on
Mm-hmm.
them, right? Because it's really, I think it's so individual. We need to remember
Mm-hmm.
this individualness, and that I think that, to have good discourse around sex requires a conservative opinion in so many ways, or
Mm-hmm.
quote conservative. I don't even think this is a conservative opinion, but
Yeah,
but like, to have these conversations, I think it's just so necessary. And
absolutely.
because as a sex educator, I can tell you that most sex educators are all about basically gender ideology theory.
Yeah. I
But
mean, that's happening in
yeah,
therapy too. In just
I
your
know.
run-of-the-mill therapy,
Yeah,
it's getting rough. And that's the
yeah.
thing, is that you can go too far to one side with things. And like you go back to that the analogy of the child. You can't just do everything, and you can't be someone's best friend. A lot of the times the best thing that you can do for someone is say, hey, I don't think that behavior is serving you, or hey, are you sure that are you sure about that?
Mm-hmm.
Let's dig on that, instead of just being like, hey, you like it, okay, cool. We do a lot of things that we like that aren't good for us at all.
Yeah.
And I think examining that and being, I think we're having such a gut, like a knee-jerk reaction to any type of restriction on sexuality. And it's almost like, oh, you're it's like you're a nerd or something, like how dare you not want
Be a
to, like,
prude.
and it's like, just be a prude in the way that suits you. And if that's not even being a prude, okay, fine. But define it for yourself. I think that's what's
Yeah.
really lacking today, is that we're letting society define things for us again, which is funny because that's the very ill that we were escaping, which was, oh, we don't want society to tell us what to do. Okay, now we're letting everybody else, our peers, tell us what to do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Same
Yeah.
problem.
Very cool. Yeah. Thank you for having this awesome conversation with me. I can't believe that was an hour.
Oh my gosh, I know it went so fast, and honestly, we could keep going. This is
We
a
could.
meaty topic, but it was
Yeah.
such a pleasure. I am so glad that we're having these conversations, because
Yeah.
it's a tricky subject, but it needs to be really given attention and thought.
Yes, absolutely. So next time we can spin a little bit more on philosophy and
Yes.
history.
Oh my gosh, yes. And we didn't even get to speak about courage and
I know.
how it translates into sex and relationships.
I
There's so
know.
much.
Oh yeah, courage. Oh, I like that
Mhm.
one. We'll save that
Yeah.
for next time. How about that?
Good. For
Okay.
sure.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure.
Bye.